This is Judaism Unbound, Episode 21, jOS 4.0, a new Jewish operating system? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we are here looking back at the 3 episodes in our section called New Platforms for Jewish Life, which is part of what we see as an 8-episode arc that basically looks at some of the key operators and thinkers about Jewish innovation or analogous types of innovation, such as our leadoff episode in this sequence with Casper Kyle and Angie Thurston from Harvard Divinity School. Lex, I thought that looking back on the first 3 episodes, I started to really put together some thinking about what we're seeing by looking at an analogy to computer operating systems. So give me a chance and let me lay this out, and then let's see what you think about it. So I'm thinking this way, that when you have a computer operating system and people start to, over time, run and write new apps for it, over time they try to sort of push the operating system to do more and more, and the apps eventually get sort of so complex that there are aspects of the operating system or maybe the hardware that just can't run those apps anymore. And the writers, the people using it, are still trying to push and push, but at a certain point, these apps start to cause the operating system to crash all the time. And, I'm thinking that basically for various reasons, we've talked about the Enlightenment, the Emancipation, America, intermarriage, which relates to all those, and all sorts of other apps, and we could sort of talk about what they are that are causing the current operating system of Judaism to keep crashing for a lot of Jews. Not for everybody, of course, but for a lot of Jews. Now, what do you do in the technological world if your operating system starts to crash a lot? I think that you basically have 3 main approaches that you could take, other than trying to get people to stop writing those apps that cause the operating system to crash. And frankly, I think that's been a lot of our strategy up till now. If you take as a given that people are going to try to run these apps and those apps are causing your operating system to crash, then you basically have 3 approaches. And I think all 3 of these approaches in one way or another can be said to fall into B'nai Lappi's option 3 category of people who are actually trying to sort of rebuild Judaism. But these are 3 different ways to rebuild Judaism in a certain sense. The first is to patch the operating system. It's really to try to figure out what aspect of the operating system is most vulnerable to these crashes, and to say, could we do something to kind of strengthen the operating system there so that it won't keep crashing? And maybe that kind of thing is like the inclusion types of things that we talked about over time. Can we be more inclusive to women if the fact that women in America have a sense of having a much more central role, equal role in society as men did in the past when Judaism, the current operating system of Judaism was kind of initially put together, and now women in America are in the same status as men, so it kind of keeps crashing the system. So let's make it more inclusive to women, and maybe the system will be able to be stable. And there are all sorts of other things that we might look at and say, fundamentally, that's a patch to the operating system, because it's not really changing the basic nature of the way Judaism works, but it's kind of making sure that some of these things that are causing problems will cause fewer problems. The second approach that you can take is to essentially upgrade the operating system. And we see this with real operating systems where, every year Apple kind of puts out a new version of its operating system. It's more or less the same as the previous one, but it has some major upgrades, some major new features. And I think fundamentally, often it has a lot of new capabilities that are under the hood that we don't really see so much. But it's more than just a patch. It really is, in many ways, kind of a rewrite, but it looks a lot like the old version. And for another 5 years, until this one starts crashing, all the apps are going to run a lot better that people are trying to do. And the third version is what I would call kind of a new release, saying that at a certain point your operating system is so problematic in terms of the apps that people are trying to run. And when the situation gets that bad and you really can't fix it anymore, you have to really rewrite the operating system completely. And I think of, at least in the computer world, we can think of when Apple moved from OS 9 to OS 10, which was such a big, huge, that was when Steve Jobs came back to Apple. That was such a huge remake of the Apple operating system that actually people don't necessarily know this history, but Apple couldn't even do it in those times. And the main reason that Steve Jobs came back to Apple at that time was because Apple couldn't figure out how to rewrite their operating system in the time that they had. And so they understood that they had to go out and find an operating system that they could import into Apple and then kind of Apple-ify it. And of course, they ended up picking Next's operating system, which was Steve Jobs' company. And it was no real surprise that Steve Jobs' new company's operating system fit in the same kind of ethos as Apple, because of course, Steve Jobs had been intimately responsible for Apple's old operating system. So in that sense, it was a very natural move, but nevertheless, it was a fundamental new computer operating system when they bought Next and made that Apple OS X. And similarly, when Microsoft moves from DOS to Windows, that's a similar situation. So it strikes me that metaphor may be useful in thinking about where we are Jewishly. And, I'm kind of thinking of it as Rabbinic Judaism is the 3.x operating system series. The first one was the first temple period before, the monarchy. The second version was the second temple period, after the return from the Babylonian exile. The third version is the Rabbinic Judaism that forms after the destruction of the second temple. And that's the main version that we're in. And you could kind of say, like, if we're in, let's say, version 3.7, a patch would be to say, hey, let's make 3.75. It's still 3.7, but it's we're fixing it. Whereas the upgrade would be, okay, can we issue a 3.8? And then the new release would be, let's go to 4.0. So sorry, that's a long laying out there, but I think this is a framework that'll ultimately be helpful for us and our listeners to either accept or challenge, but it gives us a little bit of a framework to kind of hang our conversation on.
Yeah, I think it does. And one other piece that you didn't mention, but that I know that you and I have spoken about a little bit, is that there's a bigger question too, or maybe an equal size question, of whether it's a question of patching the operating system, creating a new operating system, or another question, which is Judaism any longer an operating system in the way that it once was? And in other words, what I mean by that is the question of, does Judaism serve the role as sort of the core of people's being from which they apply wisdom, follow rules, live their lives? Or is Judaism more like one app in a broader operating system, maybe the American operating system for American Jews, or something else, the human operating system? I don't know. And I'm not sure the answer. And I think what you and I have spoken about is that there might be ways to experiment with new forms of Judaism that go in both directions. So, we could think about Jewish Without Walls, we could think about Moshe House, where they fit into this, but really in the entire Jewish ecosystem, thinking about what are the kinds of things we can do in the case that Judaism is an operating system and will always be, such that we can create a new operating system that's called Judaism that works. That's sort of group one. And also, what are the things we can do if we're actually undergoing a transition from operating system to app? What can we do that creates forms of Judaism that people can access like they would an app? And it's not just, some minor app that's on the fourth page of their cell phone that they only go to once every 3 months or once every 10 years. Like it's something that we believe it's the kind of app that you would access very, very regularly, just probably in different ways than people are accessing Judaism right now.
Yeah, and just as an example, I guess I would say that the way I think about how yoga works in people's lives is that for many people who do yoga, it's an app. It's not the very foundation of their entire life that everything else is built upon, but it's a very significant thing that they do very regularly and that has a very significant impact on their lives, versus an operating system, which I think is kind of the way that, at least when I was growing up, a lot of people were talking about Judaism as that its ideal form is that if you're a Jew, Judaism is the most basic foundational building block of your identity in your life. So you might say, I'm an American Jew or a Jewish American. We might argue about which of those two it is, but it's one or the other. And, but what it means when we're fighting about whether we're a Jewish American or American Jew is like, which of these two is the most basic foundational way in which we define ourselves? And that a lot of Jews would say that the ideal should be that Jewish is that most deep foundational aspect of your identity. And all these other things that you might like to do can be essentially apps that run on that operating system. And one of the big tensions, I think, is a version of, if Judaism is your most basic operating system, then how does America fit in? And if America is your most basic operating system, first of all, is that a problem Jewishly? And second of all, how does Judaism fit in? But then I think one of the places that we've been talking about too is essentially what I heard Anita Diamond say in the most stark way, which was that when people ask her if she's a Jewish writer, she says, I'm a woman, I'm a female writer, a Jewish writer, an American, and she could give like 7 other descriptors, and she says, I'm all of those and then a writer, and that there really isn't this foundational single operating system that people are running on in their lives as this most basic foundational thing. I guess the question is whether that's realistic, whether that's true or not, or whether somebody who's trying to say that they have 7 different key identities, would it be right to say then therefore there's like some kind of human operating system, or at least America really is their most deep operating system because people do need a certain grounding? Or are we saying that we're almost in a post-operating system phase where we don't even need to think about it that way anymore?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue to analyze, this question of whether Judaism or Jewishness is or should be sort of the core part of who Jewish humans are, and then the other parts of their identities sort of are on the side or on top of that in some form. And it's funny because as I think about myself, I often read opinion pieces or various books, etc., that talk about how because I am Jewish, I stand for X. And often that X is some political belief, some form of morality. And I've always recoiled at that idea that I get my political beliefs from my Judaism. I'm about the most engaged Jewishly you could be. I mean, I do Jewish every day. I work for a Jewish organization. I'm studying to be a rabbi. But I don't think when I decide where I stand on a particular political question, when I read a new piece of nonfiction, any of that, I don't think I come to the conclusion I come to because of my Judaism. I don't think that that's there undergirding every political stance I have or every moral belief I have. And I think that I'm pushed by some people to say that it does because we live in this paradigm of Judaism is an operating system. And it's the engine that causes the rest of you to run. And by saying it's an operating system, it becomes really central, regardless of what you do, by the way. If it's an operating system, you can come to whatever political conclusion you want, whatever moral stance. And if you say it's because of my Jewishness, well, then you're conceivably a successful Jew, right? But if Judaism is an app, if Judaism is something, a set of texts and culture and history and whatever that you access here and there, or even every day, then it suddenly transforms.
Early on in our podcast series, I don't remember exactly, you brought in Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And what Kuhn is talking about in that book is that in a time, this happens in science, that what happens is you're living happily along in whatever your scientific paradigm is, and there just keep being these anomalous results that keep popping up and these anomalous things that keep happening. And for a while, you don't recognize them as kind of a pattern that's fitting together. But what really these anomalous results are saying to you is that already we're starting to see that our system isn't really working, and that eventually those anomalous results, sort of somebody comes to understand that they actually aren't anomalous, that they actually are signifying a true, an other system that's more correct than the one that we've been living under, and that it's sort of like, I think I gave that quote that I really love by William Gibson that says the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed, and so by looking around at what people are already doing in their attempt to live within the operating system of Rabbinic Judaism, we're seeing that new approach to Judaism is already there. And specifically, you're talking about it as an app. Like, I think it's really interesting to think about that question of, like, is it that we're moving from one Jewish operating system to another Jewish operating system? Or are we potentially seeing a even more revolutionary change in the basic nature of Judaism, which is that it would move from an operating system into an app, and like you said, a really important app that runs on a different operating system. Or maybe, and this, for our computer nerd friends could be something even more exciting, that it becomes a cross-platform app, right? And that it's able to actually run on many different operating systems. And actually, when we think of cross-platform apps like Gmail or Google Docs, those might be apps and not operating systems. And so you might look at those and say they're somehow inferior because they're apps and not operating systems. But actually, the fact that they're apps and not operating systems means that even more people are using them, even more dedicatedly, right, because they work on any operating system. So in that sense, Judaism may not have to be quite as exclusive as it used to be, and then becomes even more powerful.
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking. And more than that, if Judaism is an app and not an operating system, then that means a few things. One is what you just said, which is that it works on whatever people's operating systems are. So that, I think, would imply, to get out of the tech language for a second, whether you are born Jewish and have sort of that historical operating system in quotes, or you're not, you can still access Judaism, which I think we've been talking about. We've been talking about how more and more people, whether they're born Jewish or not, are accessing parts of Judaism. And then there's the other side, which is that more and more people who are Jewish are accessing other, quote, apps. If Judaism's an app, then so are many other religions, and non-religions. To get back to Casper and Angie, so are SoulCycle and CrossFit and all of these things that provide deep meaning and accountability and the various 6 pieces that they talked about. And the ramifications of that are big. I mean, it means that our entire way of looking at A, Judaism, and B, religion, as something you are and not something that you do, it might be shifting. Because the second something is an app as opposed to an operating system, right? You have to open the app. The operating system, whatever you do, you're operating. My computer is going right now, whether I open Microsoft Word or not. But if Judaism becomes an app or a program, say Microsoft Word or whatever it is, you have to open it. And I actually think that's good for Judaism. It means that in order to deeply engage and build Judaism, we have to actively take it on as our own project, and open that app and do something with it. Whereas if Judaism is an operating system, then whatever you do, you're Jewish. So you don't have to do anything. You can just live your life, not enter a Jewish institution, not crack a Jewish book, not eat Jewish food, whatever it is. And it doesn't really matter. You're still Jewish. And I resist that a little because I not because I think people who do that are bad. I think that's fine. But because I think that accessing the Judaism and applying it to our world, to our lives, to our communities is really what's powerful. Not like being Jewish and sharing that fact with other people who are Jewish.
Up till the last point that you made, I was totally with you. And then with the last point, I'm still with you, but I just want to make a clarification, which is that, like, when I think of somebody who might say Judaism is my operating system, but I don't really do anything Jewish, I guess, like, then we really have to define that operating system as meaning that Judaism is fundamentally like a tribal, familial relationship, right, that doesn't include any kind of content that's specific. I think, I really love this description that Yehuda Kurtzer from the Hartman Institute has given about that there are kind of 2 kinds of Jews or Judaism. He calls them Genesis Jews, which really fundamentally look at the Judaism presented in the book of Genesis, which is sort of a family. It's an identification with a family, a people, versus the Judaism that's presented in Exodus, which is, the Sinai. It's a set of content that people live up to or live with, whether they're originally from this family or not, and Yehuda generally says that it's a continuum. We're all somewhere on the continuum between Genesis and Exodus in terms of what drives us. And I guess, for a lot of people that's true. But, for me, when I think about Judaism being an operating system, I imagine that it means that you do a lot of very specific things. But I loved what you were saying, which is that the difference between an operating system and an app is that if it's an operating system, then I just sort of wake up in the morning and I like mindlessly start doing those things, or mindfully. But the point is that I just do them because like they're very integrated into my most basic understanding of who I am and what my life is like. And I think that we can certainly see that, very clearly in, for example, ultra-Orthodox Judaism, that's kind of how it operates. But, I also think that there are a lot of other kinds of Judaism and kinds of Jews that really just wake up in the morning and Judaism like permeates literally everything that they do and undergirds everything that they do, as opposed to an app, like you say, which you have to open. And that raises in my mind something that I was just talking about the other day with a group of people that I was talking with, and it hit me again that it feels to me like the question of why be Jewish is not a question that has been integral to Judaism, to the development of Judaism, for sure, at least over the last 2,000 years or so, right? That and maybe ever, right? That the idea that why be Jewish, right? It was just an acknowledgement we are Jewish. Like, the reason why we're Jewish is because we are Jewish. We were born Jewish. And maybe some people would answer because God commanded it. Also, we were born Jewish and God commanded it. But somehow the question of why be Jewish was something that we just assumed we took as a given, and then the question was really how to be Jewish, that we were debating over, and what are the things that Jews do. But now I think because of the forces that we've talked about, the Enlightenment, the Emancipation, America, it's clear, I think it's clear to most people, it's been put in the terms like we're all Jews by choice today, right? Meaning the only people who are really going to live a Jewish life are people who have chosen to live a Jewish life. It's not something that you have to do. You can easily drift away. But it means, like, if we're talking again back into sort of scientific terms, that from an evolutionary perspective, there's now an evolutionary pressure upon Judaism that comes from the ability of people to easily go away from Judaism. And essentially, it's been talked about that Judaism lives in a marketplace. That's another way to put it. But in a scientific perspective, I would say there's now evolutionary pressure on Judaism that it has to answer the why question in order to continue. Because if people don't see why I should be Jewish, then many people are just not going to be Jewish. What you're adding to that basic perspective, I think, is a really interesting twist, which is to say that the question of why should I use this is really an app question and not an operating system question. And maybe by definition, if we accept that for most people, most of the time, they're going to have to actively open that Jewish app or it's not going to be opened. And they're only going to open that app if they have a reason for opening that app. That fundamentally, what the point that you're making is that, maybe it just doesn't seem likely, right? Maybe, I've been thinking about it as the most likely scenario in a way, or the most natural scenario would be that Judaism moves from being operating system version 3 to being operating system version 4, and that another possibility could be that it turns into an app. But maybe it's actually the most likely possibility, if Judaism is to go into a new iteration, is that it would become an app, fundamentally because of this why question being so significant in our time. If we think of Judaism as an app, then we can start to think about people who use the app constantly. I think about Facebook. I mean, there's people who are constantly on Facebook. It's not their operating system because nothing else is running on it, but they're constantly, we've got it open on a window and they're doing other things at the same time on their computer, on their phone, but they're constantly going back to Facebook. Versus people who look at Facebook once or twice a day, versus people who look at Facebook once or twice a week. And of course, there are people that aren't on Facebook at all. But now all of those people are using Facebook, right? And they're actually using it pretty significantly, but they're still using it, some more than others. And, I'm not sure how helpful it is to say, are you a Facebook person or are you not a Facebook person?
Right.
They're all Facebook people, but they're different. They have different mixtures. But actually, like, versus, are you a Mac user or a PC user, which really is a real definition of a person, because if somebody's a Mac user, then they're not going to be able to run this app that you might be telling them about. And if they're a PC user, they might be not able to run that app that you're telling them about. Versus if you're a Facebook user, that doesn't say whether or not you're going to be able to run this other app. So that's kind of in the metaphor, I think that's sort of an interesting illustration. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is that, maybe at least in the transition between versions or forms of Judaism, it starts that Judaism isn't a single app. Actually, Judaism is, maybe we would even, once if we're accepting the app instead of operating system part of the metaphor, then in this transitional period, Judaism isn't even an app. It's actually a folder of a bunch of apps. And that bunch of apps has some connective tissue that makes us put them all in the same folder. And kind of think of them as related, and they can maybe work in an integrated way more than other apps can. I use Gmail, but I don't really use Google Docs very much, and that works okay. But if I used both, they would work together better. And instead I use Gmail and Dropbox. And some people like you, it annoys. But it works for me. And does that make me like a fundamentally wrong person? So maybe you think so.
Not for that reason,
right? But I'm just thinking about, like, coming up next, the next few weeks, we're talking about One Table, which is about elevating the idea that people should be having Friday night dinners in their homes. Or we're talking about Hello Mazel, which sends people various materials that they can use to create Jewish experience in their homes. Or we're also talking, and we've talked about the Maim Chayim Mikvah, which is a particular Jewish ritual that can be reimagined and used. But the idea is that anybody who's using that ritual, they may or may not be using other Jewish rituals. And it works either way. And if somebody's only Jewish practice is to come, once a month or twice a month or 3 times a year to the Maim Chayim Mikvah to mark certain occasions of transformation, then I think we would all kind of agree that they're having a profound Jewish experience, certainly on an app level. And there could also be people who go to the mikveh, once a week or whatever, and also go to synagogue once a week. And for them, those two experiences work even more powerfully together because they feel that one strengthens the other. And I think that the vision that we're kind of exploring in this episode is really not saying that the old stuff isn't working. It's saying that some of the old stuff isn't working, and that some degree of the connective tissue of the old stuff may not be working in quite the same way, maybe in serious ways, but nevertheless, in the same way that we're really excited about the Maim Chayim Mikvah, which seems like such an old, irrelevant to many people Jewish practice, the idea of, that some magical thing is going to happen when you immerse yourself in water, but actually, they have successfully shown that even such an ancient, sort of seemingly non-modern, problematic ritual can be, when it's worked on independently, can be really turned into something exciting that's working and exciting in different ways for all sorts of modern American Jews, that could be true of, just about any particular Jewish practice that you could imagine. And so, maybe what we're seeing here is that one option is to sort of look at the disruptive innovation pathway and say some new idea of Judaism is going to come about from some real invention, outside of the existing system. And another, it could be a supplement or it could be an alternative, is to say there can also be really amazing, exciting, important innovation work done by looking at the existing system, but instead of looking at it as a system, looking at it as a bunch of different modules that, as long as we're willing to unbundle, we're able to do some exciting things with. And that unbundling, of course, brings to mind the situation of the music industry that, for a long time was able to sell you an album. They were able to package music as an album, and people would buy the album even if they only really loved one song, because that was pretty much the only way that it was made available. And then Napster and iTunes and whatever came along and made it possible to buy one song at a time, and people did do that. And and so that has sometimes made people have to come up with album ideas in different ways, and sometimes it's just made people do albums the same way, but people only buy the songs that they really love. And we can make that analogy to Judaism and say that same kind of, pressure might result in any sort of variety of responses from Jewish people and Jewish institutions, but it's not a negative thing for music that happened to the music industry. It might be a negative thing for the recording companies that dominated in the 20th century, but there are all kinds of new approaches to music coming about, and it's a hard time for music. There's a lot of people saying, look, there's some real loss there, and there is, but at the same time, my prediction would be that on the other end of it, we're still going to have music, and probably just like, even though Kodak and Polaroid went bankrupt, but photography has never been more exciting and healthier, probably we're going to see a lot of the music companies go bankrupt, and music will end up never being healthier. And I would put out there that I think we could see that for Judaism, that it's not the same to say that some of the institutions won't be able to survive, won't be able to modify themselves because they're fundamentally built on putting a bundle and a system out there. But new organizations are going to come that distribute Judaism in a different way, and that might even make it possible for people to truly deeply connect to Judaism, whether in the former system you would have seen them as disaffiliated Jews or even non-Jews, that would really be able to get deep connection to Judaism, but just in a somewhat of a different way, more of an app sort of way than an operating system sort of way. And that's exciting to me.
I think this unbundling point is crucial. And it's funny because I think back to the allusion you made earlier about Google Drive and Dropbox, and how you and I have joked about how, you prefer Dropbox much more, I prefer Google Drive. And I'm sort of in the Google scheme of things. I use Gmail, I do Google Drive, I always do Google Maps as opposed to Apple Maps. And it's so interesting because I had never thought about it through this lens before. But so when I respond to you and say, ugh, you're making me depart Google to go to Dropbox, it resembles the response of people that think if you go and explore Buddhism, you're crossing a line. If you engage with some piece of another religion, if you were to use an Arabic prayer from Islam in a Jewish service, for a lot of people, that feels really either wrong or maybe not wrong, but just sort of a little out of place. And for me, maybe it's because I've been in some prayer settings where we do use, a variety of languages and some sources from other religious traditions and etc. I think that it's worth pushing back against that. And it's funny because I'm pushing back against myself on this Dropbox example, right? But I think that the unbundling that you refer to, that's happening so clearly in music, in so many parts of our lives, we haven't fully applied to religion.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I was also thinking as you were talking about how with phones, there's Apple, iOS, and Samsung, which is basically Android. And what happens is that Android will come up with some invention, and then Apple will copy it and integrate it into the new version of iOS, and vice versa, and then they sue each other, and then
Right.
Sometimes they actually win the lawsuit, but a lot of the time the courts basically say this is just how science and how technology works. Your advantage is that you came up with it first, so you got the extra year or whatever of people that got excited about your product because you had that feature, and you just kind of have to step up your game. I think there's a lot of discussion in the patent world about which is the better approach. And I think about things like when you look at religions or whatever we want to call a different kind of Judaism, call it a post-religion or whatever it ends up being, you could kind of look at it as very similar. It's there's a sense that if you borrow something from another religion, it's really bad, except then when you look back at Jewish history, you see so much of Judaism was borrowed from other religions, and so much of Judaism was borrowed by other religions. And, but when it's happening today, you kind of see it as problematic. And that's exactly what we see in the technology world, that even though their whole technology was built, for example, Apple's whole technology was for the computers was built on something that originally Xerox developed. But when Google rips off some parts of how the iPhone works, Apple is very aggrieved. And the fact that a lot of people seem comfortable today borrowing various parts of other religions. And I put yoga, I think yoga should be kind of front and center here, because a lot of people say, well, yoga has moved from being a religious thing to being a, exercise thing. But that's only because they didn't have the same allergy to it, 20 years ago.
I think what that gets at is, to some extent, as we talk about operating systems morphing to apps, et cetera, I think that discontent over the Beatles and others in the 60s going and immersing themselves in Asian religions, Asian cultures, et cetera, often Buddhists, occasionally Taoist, Hindu, whatever it was. I think that part of the reason there was so much discontent is because Western was sort of an operating system and Eastern was seen as like a competing operating system. And that's why, by the way, and we can look at all of the bloody history of this, that's why so many Western countries went and tried to colonize non-Western countries. They were seen as fundamentally like separate entities. If you're one, you're not the other. And now we live in a globalized world where I think in many ways it's not even a present tense idea of it's in the process of collapsing, that paradigm. I think it's already collapsed. I think with the internet, which in a literal way makes me and somebody in Australia or Russia or South Korea in the same place in a certain sense by being at the same website, it totally casts aside the idea that we must be in sort of separate silos. So it's very easy for us to say with yoga, oh, sure, we're using something that stems from Asia originally, and that's fine. Once again, with religion, for whatever reason, we haven't gotten there yet.
Right. With Western religions, you're right, intra-Western religions, we haven't done that, and yet we seem to have, in many cases, comfortably done that by now with Eastern religion and Western religion. And again, I think scholars and other people could explain how they're different and how the same contradictions aren't there, and there's a lot to that. But it's interesting to think about, how that process might look going forward, to the broader point that in a way that we don't even really fully remember, that 50 years ago, Western and Eastern were seen as, as a binary, as contradictory in a way that we don't even conceive of it that way anymore, that we're probably looking at patterns in not just religion, sort of every dimension of what it is to be human collapsing in terms of a lot of those binaries. And, what I would want to just explore about Judaism is whether, one way I think a lot of people think about Judaism as, Judaism is fundamentally about setting off from the world. The word kadosh, holy, which is a significant word in Judaism, literally means separated. And there's an idea that a very deep virtue and an inherent virtue, an inherent part of Judaism is to be separated. And there are others who look at Jewish history and they say, but that's actually never been what we've done. And in fact, we've been so permeable. And to look at Judaism and to say that it's been hermetically sealed from the rest of the world throughout its history is to not see Jewish history as it was. I think probably the reality is that it's both and, that Judaism has always had the kind of debates that we're having, and that it actually is the debate itself that is the Jewish tradition, and the rest of it is a matter for, history to sort itself out. But the thing that I really want to put out there in closing of this episode in particular is that I think that we should consider the possibility that in this time in history, to try to make Judaism hermetically sealed off from some of the larger forces that are operating in the world is not only not going to work in terms of preserving Judaism, but it's missing an opportunity for Judaism if it's truly worth preserving, right? If we truly can ask and answer that question of why be Jewish, then there's an opportunity in a world of choice, in a world where every person in the world has choices about how to live their lives and what material to access and to be inspired by and to build a life around or with as a significant part, that Judaism really has the power to play a role in so many more people's lives, certainly Jews, and even others, and we have to decide how much we want that, how much that would be a good thing or a bad thing. But if there's a sense that this is a wonderful thing, then part of me says, why should it be denied to anybody who can find meaning in it?
I just want to reinforce what you're saying because I think it's so important. And when I'm talking to people about this, I've heard very few people who say, oh, sure, yeah, I really want Judaism to silo itself off from the world and be its own thing. Most people think, well, of course, that's right. Like, I agree that Judaism should connect to the rest of the world, but also be its own thing. And I just want to, in order to clarify what we're saying and sort of deepen it, I wanted to bring up one recent scenario I saw from the Jewish press and sort of resulting conversations. And and we'll feature this in our show notes on our website, which was, there was an article that I saw about a school in Utah, which is a Jewish school, but the vast majority of students were not Jewish. And there were all these debates happening about whether that's good or bad or neutral. To me, it's not at all a problem that there would be some, or even occasionally, a majority of people in a particular space that are not Jewish, but they are gathering to engage in forms of Judaism.
So as we close the show, I want to give our listeners just a little bit of a sense of where we're going. There are a number of practical matters that came up in the last few episodes, such as the funding issues and all sorts of other issues that have been brought up by our guests. And what our plan is to, we wanted to give you this perspective at this stage to try to provide more of a lens through which to think back on our last few episodes and also our upcoming few episodes as part of this 8-episode arc, to put out this metaphor and see how it works for our listeners for as you're thinking this stuff through. When we have our next episode, that's just me and Lex talking, we are planning to continue this part of the conversation a little bit and deepen it even more and think about some of the examples of the organizations that we've been talking to. Just to put out my sense, I think that we could look at any of these organizations and what they're doing in all three of the categories that we put out there, the patch, the upgrade, or the new release. Whether or not any of those or all of those are in the minds of the folks that are doing this work, I think it's interesting for those of us who are looking at the work to try to think about, well, what would it look like if these organizations worked on this level or that level? And I think that one of the interesting pieces is going to be that I would suggest that a lot of the organizations that we're seeing now can be thought of as technologies that could work on any of those approaches. And so it's going to be one of the interesting pieces as we go forward to think about what are people trying to do versus what might happen in the future. And those things are not always going to be the same. We're really excited about the last few episodes and the episodes coming back and where this is taking us in our thinking about the Jewish future. And I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And as always, we want to encourage folks to be in touch with us. And there's a few different ways for you to do that. The first is to like our Facebook page, which is called Judaism Unbound. And you can also visit our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where we have all of our show notes, including for this episode, but also all of our earlier episodes. And last but not least, we always love receiving emails from our listeners. You can reach us at lex@nextjewishfuture.org and at dan@nextjewishfuture.org. With that, this has been Judaism Unbound.